So welcome to today's webinar, part 1 webinar on Reimagining Business Part 2. I hope you're all well. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. It's great to see so many people still supporting us on this project. My name is Molly Dilling, and I am a trainee solicitor in the commercial department at Patel, and I will be your host for this webinar. My job is to push the right buttons, ask any questions, and generally keep things on track. So this is an informal chatty style webinar, so please do get involved and ask any questions that you may have. We would please ask that you do this by using the questions button at the bottom of the screen. Just type in any questions you have, and we will try and cover as many questions as possible during the presentation or at the end. So just a bit of housekeeping before I hand over to our lovely presenters today. So the webinar is going to last approximately 20 minutes, but with questions it may run for up to 30 minutes. We will be recording the webinar, so the link will be shared to you all afterwards, and there'll also be a summary handout that we'll be sending to you as well. So the purpose of today's webinar is for our panelists to share with you some useful information, practical tips and guidance on the topic of reimagining business. So this is the second of the two-part series in our Reimagining Business webinars. And today our presenters are going to be talking about revisiting the business model canvas. So just as a disclaimer, any advice that we will give you is generic and it should not be relied upon unless you've spoken to us separately and we've provided you with advice that's pertinent to your individual circumstances. So as I said, in today's webinar, we'll be talking about reimagining business, part 2. And to present the topic, I'd like to hand over to our presenters, Katen, Patel and Luke Wilkins, who are both trainee solicitors in our corporate and commercial department. Thank you, Katen and Luke.
Thank you, Molly, for that wonderful introduction. So my name is Luke Wilkins, and today, me and my colleague, Katen Patel, will be talking you through today's topic, which is reimagining business. Now, before we go too much further, if you've not watched last week's webinar, please do stick with us today. But afterwards, you may find it useful to go back and watch last week's webinar, which goes through part 1, which is how a business can utilize the business model canvas. So let's get stuck in with today. Today, we're going to be looking at the reimagination process. So wouldn't it be great to see how a business model canvas can help a business to reimagine itself in light of changes and events that impact the business? So what we're going to be looking at is how we use the business model canvas that we discussed last week, and we use that to reimagine the business, and that's due to the changes that have been happening around and in the business itself. So first of all, let's think about what type of changes it is that we're going to be looking at. So there are various types of changes or events that may impact the business. These can be external and often involuntary. And a perfect example of this is the recent pandemic. But there are also things like regulation changes, which can happen at any time. There are also various internal and more voluntary changes which may happen to a business. And so these can be the business leaders changing or adapting their strategy or objectives, changing the working practices of the firm, changing the way the management and the staff go about their business, and of course things like the trading location changing. So first of all, before we go too much further, let's have a look at Parker Bullen's business model canvas. And this is what we set out last week, where we showed you exactly how a business leader may go through and fill out all of these sections. So on the left-hand side, we have the in-house segments, which are key partners, key activities, and key resources. Then we have the central part of the model, which is the promises of the business, which are the value propositions. And then on the right-hand side, we have the client-facing element, which is customer relationships, channels, and customer segments. Now, as you can see from the business model canvas, it has all of the elements of the business already set out there. And we can see where a change happens within the business, how that may affect the canvas. So for example, if there is an internal change, the business leader may decide that one of the customer segments should change. Or alternatively, they need different key activities or new key resources. And so that will then lead to other segments in the canvas needing to change as well. And this really kicks us off with the reimagination process, which Katen is now going to talk you through.
Thank you, Luke. So what I'm going to do now is talk about this process of reimagining a business. And I'm going to split this up into 3 reimagining processes. So we've got here the reimagination of a business's strategy, the reimagination of the roles of leaders within the business, and of course the reimagination of the role of everyone working within a new business environment that's come about as a result of some sort of change. And when we go through and consider each of these in a moment, we'll be applying them to a case study. And that case study we're going to use is the same as last week's. So we're going to use Parker Bullen. With Parker Bullen, obviously, is a law firm, but that is in itself business. So what often happens at Parker Bullen is that when a change comes along or a change is initiated by our business leaders, the leaders themselves like to go through this process of reimagination to try and reimagine the business. And it starts, as Luke helpfully mentioned, with amending the business model canvas accordingly. So implementing changes into the business model canvas in ways that they think might be appropriate. And once that's happened, you can then embark upon this reimagination process. So let's start, first of all, with reimagining a business's strategy. What do we mean by that? Well, we mean reimagining the business's overall direction, its purpose and its heading. We take a look at the change that's come along or has been implemented, and we can consider whether there needs to be a change of who the business is targeting at, so who it's aiming its business at, what it is that the business is promising its customers, and that relates to the CVPs, the value propositions, which Luke mentioned are at the center point of the business model canvas themselves. And we can also consider whether there needs to be a change in how a business is going to deliver the promises that it's giving. And perhaps that may mean that there needs to be a change in the type of customer, so a change in the customer segments, and all those things on the right-hand side of the canvas. And with Parker Bullen as an example, when the pandemic hit and the country went into lockdown, our business leaders themselves, in their minds, considered each of these 3 questions in order to reimagine the overall strategy of the business. And they concluded that, well, from the perspective of who we aim our businesses at, well, there isn't a real need to change that as such. I mean, we provide a legal service and each department has their own unique segments as to who they aim their services at. And we still need to promise our clients the same great service that we do. But of course, the change itself, the pandemic, did mean that we would have to change how we deliver our promises, how we deliver our service. And of course, we're still having to do that now. A lot of it's having to be moved to electronic means rather than face to face. So that's reimagining the strategy of a business. Let's look now at reimagining the role of leaders, or maybe just one leader if it's a solely run business, and the roles of those leaders within the business. And by this, I mean considering whether there needs to be a hierarchical change in leadership. Does the structure of and the leadership of a business need to change as a result of the change that's happened? Does a business need more managers, or does it need less managers? And where do those managers need to be placed within the business? If the business is quite a large one with multiple layers of management, does the amount and the size of leadership teams at each level need to change? And finally, also, aside from structural changes, we could also look at whether there needs to be a shift in the leader's focus as a result of the change. So the leader's focus and what it is the leaders do themselves. And in some businesses, we see that leaders try to lead by example, and they do much of the day-to-day work. So the consideration could be, well, does that need to change so that the leader is taking more of a sort of backseat approach within the business, or more of a sort of navigational role at a different level? And using the Parker Bullen commercial department here as an example, completely unrelated to the COVID, but our department leader, Mark Lello, realised during his reimagination process and his thought around this topic that what needs to happen is that perhaps there needs to be a shift away from him doing specific client work, and he could become more of a leader who is supporting and navigating the team around him. And that's something that we're starting to see happen now. And I think whilst we're talking about all of this, it's important to bear in mind that all of this interlinks to the business model canvas. So the canvas in all its sort of visual and graphic glory can help answer these reimagination questions by giving a business leader a sort of visual illustration of all the different parts and elements to the business, from sort of like the underbelly of the business on the left hand side of it and all of the sort of promises in the middle and the delivery on the right. So that's how that can really interrelate to these questions. And the third and final reimagination is the reimagining of the roles of everyone within the new business or work environment. And by that we mean looking at how the changes are impacting or going to impact upon the working practices of the individuals. Do specific employees and workers need to be more flexible as a result of the change? We've certainly seen a little bit more of that recently with the pandemic. And also, will there need to be more or less team working in order for the business to achieve its outcomes that are on the right-hand side of that business model? And also more on a sort of more personal level, how will the changes affect employee morale, employees' physical ability to work? We've seen a lot more working from home. Well, all businesses have seen a lot more working from home lately. And of course, you've got the mental health of employees, which is also important. So using Parker Bullen as an example then, well, when the pandemic hit and we went into lockdown, using that as the example change here, our business leaders had to reimagine how the roles of us as employees would need to change as a result of this sort of big change that's happening around us. And indeed, like many of us, some of us were furloughed for some period of time, others had to take on more responsibility, so that had to be thought about. And our working practices changed. Our IT team had to go into overdrive, getting us all equipped for working from home. And so many of the roles of those within the business had to change. And of course, they're still changing today, which in itself is a good reminder that it's not a bad thing to regularly go through this whole reimagining process in this way. So to just summarize this initial process then, what are the benefits of doing this sort of exercise in your mind? Well, there are three main benefits. Firstly, we've got the fact that it would help the business leaders to make changes and tweak the business model canvas. But I think 2 and 3 are probably more significant in that leader confidence. I think going through this process will help instill confidence in business leaders, in that it will help them understand that perhaps their business can cope with the changes that are happening around them, because it's completely normal for business leaders to be apprehensive when changes happen. And slightly linked to that, we've also got the fact that it could mean that there's less concern amongst staff about changes, because staff can see and employees can see that the business is adapting and changing, and the leaders are taking into account those changes when the business is going about its day-to-day business. And as for Parker Bullen, well, we're seeing a lot of these benefits now. And as I've mentioned on the slide there, the words the mission wall. And the reason I mention that is because one of the ways in which our business leaders, in particular our senior partner Mark Lello, has gone about helping the business to go about this process is by creating this wall full of value propositions, our forward plans and core principles, etc., as a way of sort of helping us through this process. And of course, at the centre of it is the business model canvas. So this kind of thinking can definitely work. So we've talked enough now about how a business can revisit its business model canvas, and then how it can go about reimagining its strategy, the role of its leaders and its employees. But now Luke is going to talk about another process that business leaders can do in response to a change, or indeed at any time during a business journey. And that is called de-risking a business. Over to you, Luke.
Thank you, Katen. So those of you who joined us last week will remember that we spoke about this briefly, and we spoke about it in the context of once a business leader has gone through the process of creating a business model canvas, they can visually see how that they can then de-risk the business by going through each of the elements. And you'll remember that when we went through that process, we coined this phrase, prevention is better than a cure. Now, the reason that prevention is better than a cure is that it costs a lot less in general to prevent these problems from occurring than it is to cure these problems after they've surfaced. So we're going to talk through a couple of examples of how one might de-risk a business using Parker Bullen. And we're going to use the same business model canvas that we created in the webinar last week. So the first point that we're going to go through is in the key resources section. I'm not going to go through everything, but we just want to give you a flavour of how a business leader might go about de-risking a business. So let's look at it with a little bit of structure. Let's look at these issues, and then let's decide, okay, what risks might be present, and then what may a business leader do in order to prevent that risk from occurring in the future. So let's start with people. So people are obviously extremely important to our organisation, and what may happen is that there may be issues in the future with things like employee related issues, so appropriate notices, non-compete obligations after the termination of employment, what scenarios can lead to a dismissal, etc. And so how can we review and prevent those problems from happening? Well, what a business leader may do is they might review the terms of employment and review the employment policies. Now let's look at brand. Well, the brand, of course, is very important to a lot of businesses. And what might happen is that the brand might be used inappropriately by third parties. And the way that we might prevent that risk is that we might say, well, we need to ensure that IP protection is properly given over all of the brands, so that all the images and all of the marketing material is protected accordingly. And thirdly, on this slide, we've got the IT systems. So this is the perfect example of how adaptation of the business's values and where the value lies can change due to a change. So the pandemic, for example, that has had a real impact on the way we view our IT systems. IT before was, of course, very important, but now with all of these working from home conditions, IT is absolutely vital. And of course, there are various risks in IT. A firm may be vulnerable to cyber attack. There are phishing emails, and of course, there are just wear and tear breakages that may happen. And so a business leader will consider, well, do they have the correct tech support? Do they have the correct protection in place? And then possibly, is insurance a viable option? Now let's look at key partnerships. So in our organisation, Parker Bullen, the key partnerships that we have are, of course, the memberships of our organisations, but we also have connections with IFAs and accountants. Now, there can be a risk here, which can be common in other businesses as well, in that where work is being referred to and where we're working in conjunction with, say, accountants on a piece of work, relationships such as an agency relationship may start to take form. And so we need to prevent that from ever happening. So a business leader would need to set up clear lines in terms of engagement and clear contracts that state what the relationship between the organizations is, so that an agency relationship would not occur where it would not be appropriate. And then finally, let's have a look at our channels. So at Parker Bullen, we have various channels in which we deliver our service. And one thing that is pertinent to a lot of businesses, especially recently, is GDPR compliance. So a business leader may consider within their channels, well, GDPR is at risk of being breached. And so how might we ensure that that risk is prevented? Well, a business leader may consider that they need to ensure that all of the employees are up to date and clued up on the relevant regulations, and then sufficient safeguards can then be put in place as well. So that was quite quick, but hopefully it's given you a bit of a flavour of how the business model canvas itself can then be used by a business leader when they go through each of these elements, and they can pick out these elements and say, okay, there's a risk here, and how do we then de-risk it by protecting the business against that risk in the future? So let's just give you a quick summary of what we've spoken about today. We've spoken about how, in reaction to a change or event, a business leader may wish to revisit and amend their business model canvas. And then following from that, the business can be reimagined, especially focusing on its strategy, its leaders, and its people. And then a business leader can take each element of the business and de-risk it. And the key point to take away here is what we've got right at the bottom of this last slide. Every business is different. So what we've been talking about today, you may not feel like it applies directly to a business, to your business as a business leader. But what's important is every business, by going through this process, can identify and analyze exactly how useful the process is to them, and exactly which parts of the canvas are especially important to them and what is pertinent to protect. So thank you very much for coming to today's webinar, and we're happy to now take any questions that may have come through. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katen and Luke, for a very interesting webinar, I must say. And we do have a couple of questions, if I may, that have just come in. So we've got a question from Richard, who says, how often would you say a business could go about the process of reimagining itself?
I'll take that one. Good question, Richard. Hello. Thank you for coming along this afternoon. Well, I would say it really depends on the type of business. As Luke was talking about at the end there, it's every business is different. I think it would be sensible for a business to go about this sort of process every time a change comes along or is implemented. But I think it really comes down to sort of the commercial judgment of the business leaders as to whether they feel it's necessary. And in particular, in the process of reimagining parts of a business, which I talked about, in reality, of course, that isn't really a sort of a sit-down exercise. It's not something where you sort of sit down and go, right, okay, I'm going to go through all of these thinking processes now. It's probably more something that you go about during the course of a business, and as part of your role as a leader, you think about these things. And the purpose of today was really just to sort of give you a flavour of the kind of areas that could be looked at. And so I think it really comes down to the type of business and whether the leaders themselves feel there's a need to reimagine it on a regular basis. But equally, I don't see there's any major harm in doing so.
Thank you very much, Katen. We do have another question that's just come in from Linda, and Linda says that you talked about de-risking the people within your business, so your employees. What exactly would that entail?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. And the reason that's a good question is because it's a perfect example of how you can look at a particular element, such as your employees, and then have a real think about, what are the risks and how might I prevent them? That's exactly the type of thinking that we're promoting today. Molly, perhaps you would like to say a few words about this. Molly's in our employment team, so perhaps she could give some analysis for you.
Okay, well, thank you, Luke. I think when you talk about de-risking, obviously that's quite a wide word and it can have a lot of different implications for employees. But if you're talking in terms of making sure your staff are happy, or making sure you're not discriminating against your staff, or ensuring that you're protecting yourself from any potential employment claims, which obviously employment claims aren't good for the business, they aren't good for the employee, and they're not good for the overall staff morale. I think the main thing that we would say is, which we say to all our employment clients, is communication is essential. And I'm sure this doesn't just apply into the employee aspect of the business. I think this applies in all aspects of the business, that it's essential you're transparent with your employees. If you are going to make the changes, part of your reimagining business, as occasionally talked about, you should be talking to your employees at all stages of the process. So, for example, if you're going to make a shift from working in the office to working from home, communicate that with people, ensure that they're happy with it, and don't apply blanket policies to people. So, for example, if you switch it the other way and say everyone has to work in the office. That could be potentially discriminatory to those currently at the moment who may have caring responsibilities, who need to look after vulnerable family members who may be self-isolating. So, and any dealings with your employees, always never ever underestimate the importance of communication. And I think especially in this time, you really want to make sure that your employees feel valued and part of the company, because it has been a difficult year, particularly for employee morale. There's been furlough, redundancy and stuff, and that's bound to have an impact on your employees. So when you're talking about reimagining business, I would say the most important thing to consider is that your employees are your company. Your company won't, the business won't run without your employees. So make sure that they know they're valued and make sure that you constantly communicate with them. I hope that answers your question, Linda. I don't know, Luke or Katen, whether you have anything else to add.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Molly. Thank you.
Okay, well, that is the last question. So that just leaves me to say thank you very, very much for everyone who has attended the webinar today. I hope that you found it useful, and I certainly did. So I just wanted to say a massive thank you to Katen and Luke for their time today. Great webinar, and thank you to our attendees again for taking your time out of your busy schedules to support us today. There will be a link and a handout sent to all the participants. And can I also tell you about our webinar that we're hosting next week, which I'm hosting myself with my colleague on IR35. So that's about worker status and tax for contractors. So we very much look forward to seeing you all there next week, hopefully. If you have any queries or any questions about what we've talked about today, you've got Katen and Luke's email addresses and phone numbers there, so please do not hesitate to give them a call. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.